So welcome. So some very nice gentlemen asked me to speak about dependent origination tonight. And so I was like, no, 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 not dependent origination. But when I was a nun, we used to chant Paticca Samuppada every day, which was dependent origination. We would chant the links of the chain of dependent origination. So it's one of the major um, Buddhist teachings, along with, so there were a lot of major groupings of teachings in Buddhism. One is dependent origination, which I'll talk about. The other is the Four Noble Truths, and the other one is the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. And then there are a bunch of little teachings within all those, but those are the main groupings of the main teachings that the Buddha taught. Yeah. So I don't know why I've never been attracted to dependent origination when I was studying, and I was like, why haven't I been? And I think it's because I haven't really analyzed I've been aware of my experience and the links of my experience, but never really looked and analyzed, oh, this, you know, leads to that, which leads to that. But it's basically the teaching of how our reality arises and how our reality is dependent on other factors for it to arise, that we're not independent, separate beings, right? So it's also called dependent co-arising as well as dependent origination. It applies to us as well as anything and everything in the conditioned realm, in this worldly realm, right? Some people call it the law of causality. Is that how you say the word, causality? And when the Buddha was having his night of his enlightenment, he saw the chains. There are 12 links on the chain of dependent origination. He saw how they work together and how one link leads to the other, to the other. The basic teachings is that nothing exists on its own. Really, nothing exists on its own. You can look at the human body itself and see that the human body is dependent on so many different factors. We did the 4 elements meditation and how we need all of those 4 elements for our body to be able to sustain itself. That nothing, comes into this world spontaneously. We can go on and on about, a piece of paper requires pulp, which required wood, which required a tree, which required water and ground and nutrients and bugs and worms and other trees and roots. We could go on, right? And how when we burn the tree, it becomes smoke and then ash that goes in, and it changes form. It doesn't disappear, it just changes form, and how everything in the conditioned realm arises, changes, and changes into something else in the conditioned realm. Yeah. But the human mind tends to concretize and formulate and see things as independent of one another. And as you'll see from the chain of dependent origination, this is where our suffering comes from. It's another way to talk about how we suffer. This, once again, how do we create suffering for ourselves? Hello. A lot of people say that the chain of dependent origination has a lot to do with samsara, the links of suffering of samsara, the birth and creation, death cycle of birth, death, rebirth, over and over and over and over again that we're supposedly stuck in. Yeah, so the 12 links in the chain are sequential. In other words, one does lead to the other, which leads to the other, which leads to the other. And I've heard this in so many different suttas. The Buddha talks about dependent origination. And some of the suttas, he said, because this arises, then that arises, right? And when this ceases, then that ceases. So some of them are very simple. And that is in its simplest form, dependent origination, right? When this arises, it gives birth to this, which gives birth to this. When this ceases, then other things cease as well. Huh, I can wrap my brain around that, and I can see that. But this never-ending cycle of that, how we bind ourselves into suffering, it can be very helpful to see and be able to break the cycle, these chains, these 12 chains. And I'll just talk a little bit about each one. The first chain in dependent origination is ignorance. Ignorance starts everything, right? With ignorance, all the other 11 things give birth from that. So as we know, ignorance, right? Ignorance is not knowing things as they are, not seeing things as they are. Yeah. It's seeing something as beautiful and desirable that's actually going to lead us to more suffering. It's seeing something as undesirable and unwanted that would lead us to greater peace and wisdom, like meditating every day. Oh, I don't want to meditate today. I'm too tired, or whatever it is. So that's avijja, ignorance, avijja. So it's not knowing our true nature. It's not knowing the nature of cause and effect. It's not seeing things, the reality of things as they are. That's ignorance. Sometimes it's called delusion. You know, they're used synonymously. Yeah. So that's the first chain. And ignorance gives rise to formations or sankharas. If you've done Goenka meditation retreat, Goenka talks a lot in his talks about sankharas. It's a second link. It's basically mental formations, but they're volitional mental formations. They're fabrications, they're compounds, impulses, actions come out of these formations, right? So from these formations, we accumulate karma from these actions, right? So from ignorance comes these actions, or impulse, the impulse to act, right? It's the original intention or impulse to do or say or whatever. From this impulse, the sankharas, that can be physical or mental sankharas, but usually everything starts in the mind. Even the movement starts in the mind. The body won't move without the mind's directive. So sankharas are mental, mostly mental, right? From the second link of formations gives birth to consciousness, vijnana. Consciousness is seeing consciousness, hearing consciousness, tasting consciousness, touching consciousness, right? And this means we realize we're tasting, we realize we're seeing, we realize we're touching, we realize, yeah. You see, the thing is, I'm just telling you what the Buddha taught. I'm like, I don't see how formations leads to consciousness. I think that's why I haven't been attracted to it. But maybe you can. Maybe you'll be a fully enlightened being and figure this out. From consciousness gives birth to name and form, nama rupa, the fourth link, which is sometimes referred to as mentality or materiality, right? This is when we're labeling objects, right? Mental and physical acts of an individual, bunch of people talking, partying, they're drinking wine, they're eating, so we're able to name what's happening. We're able to name our experience and label our experience, right? So first comes the consciousness of seeing, hearing, tasting consciousness, and then we start to be able to name and label our experience, right? We're still not there. We still haven't formed ourselves yet. So this also tells us how we form a self, right? So the fifth link of this is the six senses, the sixfold base. seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. So our 5 or 6 senses come out of this. Salayatana. Yeah. Labeling the experience, then all of a sudden we have these 6 senses. Before it was just the consciousness of the senses. Now it's the actual senses are arising. Yeah. Then the 6th link of dependent origination is actual contact, phassa contact. So this is when the sense, we talk about this in the aggregates, right? When a sense object meets, when one of the sense organs meets a sense object, then you have contact, initial contact, if a sight or sound arises. Yeah? And then from the 6th link gives birth to Vedana, or feeling tone. That's the 7th link, which is we experience this contact as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Yeah? You confused yet? No? Okay, great. And once we have this Vedana, this experience of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, this gives birth to craving, tanha. That's the 8th link, which is considered the most dangerous link of this whole base, because it arises in response to feelings from tanha. We have cravings or sense pleasures for being, for not being. We have the major forms of craving arise. Okay, so craving alone is just craving, right? Craving arises. Then all of a sudden it gives birth to clinging, upadana, which is the 9th link. So craving arises, then we cling to, gotta have my crystal bowl. Yeah, I can't tell you how many crystal bowls I went through at the last meditation center, because we had recovery. I really like recovery groups. So I opened the center up to, when the nights that we weren't there, to either agnostic, atheist, AA or NA groups, or Recovery Dharma had a couple meetings a week, and they would accidentally knock the bowl off of where we sat and break. So they kept breaking like 3 or 4 crystal bowls. I was like, okay. Wow, I was really clinging to that crystal bowl. I would be like, not another one. Ah! Anyhow, so that's clinging. We suffer when we start to cling, right? We crave, I want a crystal bowl. This sounds so good. Oh, I crave that sound, and then I cling to it, then I suffer. Well, here we go. The next one is becoming, right? So the 10th link is becoming. This is the formation of an identity or self, which, right? Who is clinging? There has to be someone to be clinging, right? So there's the sense of becoming something that clings. That's the 10th. The 11th is giving birth to the wheel of life of samsara, the cycle of birth. So birth arises, right? Suddenly I'm born into the one who's angry that my crystal bowl, birth is the 11th chain. I'm angry that my bowl is now broken, right? Okay. And then the 12th one is aging and death. That's 12th link. So the birth is followed by the death, and where there's a sense of loss, right? So the self has lost something. Oh no, the death of my bowl. Yeah. The change, anytime anything passes away, or anything that we're clinging to, when it changes or passes away, we become, and then the birth of the self who's suffering from this death. That's the 12th link, right? Now, some people say that the Buddha said this is the cycle also that brings us back into a next lifetime of, the next life. We create the next life if we're stuck in the cycle in the next life, that we can be sure to be reborn and die and reborn and die if we continue this cycle of ignorance. But we can see it in our own life. We can see how the chain links of dependent origination start. I had once decided that I was going to become a delusion buster. I even made that song up. I'm a delusion buster. I'm a delusion buster every day, in every way. Well, that's an ignorance buster, right? Ignorance buster. Ignorance, but anyhow, so I was looking for any time that I was stuck in some form of ignorant belief or thinking, or I still look for things like that. And what I do now is oftentimes I catch myself in some kind of ignorant way of thinking, and I'm noticing craving and clinging coming to be, and then I start to suffer, and then I say, oh well. Anyone that knows me says that I'll say something that's unpleasant, or that my experience that I'm finding out unpleasant, and then I go, oh well. And that oh well is, oh, I see that I'm creating a cycle of samsara, suffering for myself. I just need to accept things as they are, right? Oh, okay, oh well, this is how it is. You know, so that reduces the amount of suffering and amount of clinging and craving when we can see, oh, I'm caught in this cycle. This process, when reversed, sometimes the Buddha did it in reverse. That's why in the suttas I got so confused. I was like, what? This backwards now. You know, here's the Paticca Samuppada Vibhanga Sutta, the analysis of dependent co-arising. And what is dependent co-arising? From ignorance as a requisite condition comes fabrications. And he goes through and said, this is a requisite for that, right? And then sometimes he goes from the opposite, when this ends, then that ends, and he goes backwards. And I'm like, what? Which one is, what? My poor little brain was like, I don't understand this. But I do understand that this gives rise to that, which gives rise to this. But when this ends, that ends. When this ends, that ends. We can go backwards as well. So you might want to just study these to see how they show up in your life. With the abandonment of ignorance, there's a cessation or ending of karmic formations, of these formations. With the cessation of karmic formations, there's a falling away of consciousness, and on and on and on. Yeah. Yeah, but we can get stuck in the weeds with this. But basically, this teaching is about interdependence and interconnection. When we truly understand how interdependent we are, ourselves with the trees, right? Without the trees, we can't breathe. Without the trees, the earth and we can see how the causes and conditions in our world today are leading to some pretty disastrous things right now. The topsoil is disappearing from the lack of trees and over farming. Our weather, so we've been just abusing the earth and taking out whatever we want from it, and clear cutting and doing all this animal agriculture. And the earth is starting to suffer now. What's happening? The weather is changing. Now we listen. We used to hear before occasional fronts coming and going. It was no big deal. And then in the springtime, I lived in the Midwest, we would have like 2 or 3 tornadoes, potential tornadoes a year in the Midwest. And now it's like every day, just tragic weather patterns all over the place. So the chain, one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. We have been in ignorance, right? Humans have been living in ignorance that we can rape and plunder and take whatever we want from this earth and there will be no consequences at some point. Right now we're dealing with the consequences. And, climate scientists say that we're going to be dealing with a lot more dire consequences in the future. Cause and effect, how suffering is caused, right? We see it in our social, political, and cultural realms. I remember 20, 30 years ago, they kept cutting education budgets, cutting money to education. And school systems were, they were cutting the arts out of a lot of school. They were cutting money, programs all over the place in school. They were not paying people enough to educate our kids. They were reducing the amount of attention our kids were, just all kinds of stuff. I'm not a teacher, I don't understand. I've just heard enough, but I kept hearing about all the cuts to education. I'm like, are you kidding? They're the most important people on our planet. They're the future of the human race, our children. We need to, if anything, we need to put more money into education. What's the future of our humans going to be like 20, 30 years from now? Right? I was thinking that 20, 30 years ago. I'm like, oh, we see it now. People believe anything that this, not everyone, but there are a lot of people who believe everything that they hear or see. Right? And now we have AI, artificial intelligence, that they're saying that it's really hard to be able to tell the difference between reality and, videos. They can create any videos of anyone saying anything. They're already doing stuff like that. But it's like, oh, okay, wait a minute. Without wise discernment, people are not going to be able to tell what's going on. We don't have wise discernment because of our educational system has just, a lot of people has not been given enough attention, right? And it's showing up in every area of our life, from not only the earth to our politics. Another example of the collective wheel of things that are arising out of conditions is racism, sexism, right? This delusion is ignorance to think that one group can subjugate or harm another group and do better, right? We end up hurting ourselves and we end up hurting other groups and we end up, hurting the collective. And it's going to show up in really painful ways, right? Wars, conflicts. How can one person, if we're truly interconnected in so many powerful ways, which we know we are when we meditate, there's this one poem that I love. How can I live dreams of beauty and glory when another human being is suffering? Yeah, you can't. So dependent origination is about transforming not only our own experience through understanding our ignorance and our craving and how we create suffering for ourselves, but how as groups of people, we're doing it to one another, because it starts on the individual basis first, right? And we get to look at how many ways that we feed into this delusion, this ignorance that we can continue to pollute our earth and be okay. I'm constantly like, should I get an electric car? Should I get solar panels? Should I go off the grid? What can I afford? It's like, oh, what's the answer? I don't know, but I know that living in the question, at least not being in the delusion anymore, the ignorance of it all. So well-known Thai meditation master Buddha Dasa Bhikkhu describes the path out of suffering as the radiant wheel. So instead of focusing, we have to see how we create suffering for ourselves, right, through this chain. But then the radiant wheel is the Noble Eightfold Path, right? the wheel of understanding, the wheel of awakening, right? Which includes wisdom, wise reflection, ethical behavior, and then, of course, meditation and development of wisdom through our personal practice. Yeah. This is the way out of the wheel of samsara. This is the way to enlightenment or nirvana, according to the Buddha. I've seen it in my own life that I suffer a lot less when I can see these chains of origination and focus on the factors that are helpful. Yeah, so we've nerded out on dependent origination. Thank you for your deep listening